They mocked the cowboy for marrying a widow. Until they saw her smile beside his fire, the small town had always been a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. People waved to each other on the dusty streets, children ran through the alleys laughing, and neighbors exchanged news as easily as they exchanged bread or milk. But when the news spread about the cowboy marrying a widow, the usual chatter carried an unusual sharpness. People didn't whisper quietly this time. They shook their heads and murmured in confusion. They didn't understand why a man who had always seemed so solitary and serious would choose a woman with a past, someone who had already lost so much. In their eyes, it was strange, almost impossible, and certainly worth talking about. The cowboy had always been known in the town. He wasn't flashy or loud, and he rarely attended the town gatherings, preferring the quiet of his land and the company of his horses and cattle. He rose early every day, working hard under the sun, guiding the cattle through the open fields, fixing fences, and making sure the ranch ran smoothly. He was respected but not admired. People often said he was reliable, steady, and serious-minded, but few could say they truly knew him. Children were shy around him because he didn't smile often. Women would glance his way at the town market but look away when he didn't return their smile. He was a man who carried himself quietly, like the wind moving over the plains, constant but unnoticed. The widow was the opposite in many ways. She had lived in the town for several years after losing her husband in an accident. People remembered the day well. The horses had bolted, the fence had broken, and her husband had been thrown, leaving the town shocked and mourning. Since then, she had lived quietly with her young son, raising him with care and patience. She had learned to cook, mend, and manage her little house alone. Yet the shadow of loss never fully left her. In her eyes, there was a mixture of sadness and strength. Some townspeople pitied her, others judged her, and a few whispered unkindly, questioning whether a woman who had lost her husband could ever be truly happy again. When the cowboy's intentions became known, the whispers became louder. People watched from the corners of the streets, pretending to be busy, but actually keeping their eyes on the widow and the man who had asked for her hand. Some women muttered to each other, "Why would he choose her? She carries so much pain." Men would shake their heads, commenting, "He could have married someone younger, someone without the burden of loss." Even the children, curious as they were, could sense the tension. They whispered and giggled, not fully understanding, but mimicking the worry and suspicion of the adults around them. The wedding itself was simple. There was no grand celebration, no extravagant dress, no flashy carriage. The townspeople were not invited in any formal sense, though a few came quietly, drawn by curiosity. The ceremony was held near the small wooden church that had stood on the hill for decades, overlooking the town and the fields beyond. It was a place where many other weddings had been celebrated, where laughter and music had filled the air, but this time the air felt different, still and quiet, heavy with expectation and doubt. The cowboy stood at the front, tall and steady. His hat was removed, revealing hair that had turned silver at the edges. His eyes, usually reserved and unreadable, softened as he looked at the woman he had chosen. She walked down the narrow aisle, holding her young son's hand. Her dress was simple but elegant, sewn with care, reflecting both her grief and her hope for the future. Her eyes flickered with emotion. For a moment she hesitated at the doorway, catching her breath, feeling the weight of the stairs and whispers surrounding her. But she stepped forward anyway, guided by the hand of the man who had chosen to stand beside her. As they exchanged vows, the town's skepticism lingered in the air like a shadow. Some of the older women muttered under their breath about loyalty and propriety, while a few young girls whispered about what might have been better matches. Yet, despite the murmurs, the cowboy spoke clearly and calmly, promising care and companionship, while the widow answered with quiet strength, showing her willingness to accept a new chapter in her life. No grand gestures, no dramatic tears, just a quiet, sincere exchange that spoke of steady commitment rather than fleeting passion. After the ceremony, the couple left town together. They rode toward the cowboy's ranch, their figures silhouetted against the setting sun. Dust rose under the hooves of the horses, and the horizon glowed with shades of orange and pink. The townspeople watched from their windows and doorways, shaking their heads, whispering and forming opinions they were sure were right. They didn't know what the future would hold, but they felt certain of one thing: this union was unconventional, strange, and unlikely to last. The first nights on the ranch were quiet. The widow noticed how different life was from the town she had known. The house was simple, with wooden floors and creaking doors. The fireplace was large and cold, waiting for a fire to warm the rooms. Outside, the fields stretched endlessly, and the sounds of cattle, wind, and distant hills filled the air. She was not used to such isolation. In the town, there were always neighbors stopping by, the market bustling with people, children playing in the streets. Here there was silence, sometimes comforting, sometimes daunting. The cowboy, aware of her unease, did not rush her. He guided her gently, showing her how to feed the animals, mend fences, and move confidently around the property. The widow felt clumsy at first, unsure of how to handle the tools or guide the horses. Her son watched closely, eager to learn, and slowly the three of them began forming a new rhythm. The days were long and the work was hard, but there was also an unexpected calm. The widow began noticing small things: the sound of the wind in the trees, the smell of fresh hay, the way the sun rose over the hills in the morning. She began to understand the land, to feel a part of it, to imagine herself living here, despite the doubts that lingered in her mind. Back in town, the whispers continued. "I told you it wouldn't last," some said. "He'll tire of her," others predicted. Few understood the quiet bond forming on the ranch. The way the cowboy's steady care helped the widow feel alive again. They could not see the small moments: the careful way he placed a bucket of water near her, the soft encouragement as she learned to ride a horse, the quiet smile he gave when she spoke her mind or laughed softly at something her son said. These were moments invisible to the outside eye but powerful enough to shape their new life together. People in town remained suspicious. They judged from afar, imagining that the widow might regret her choice, imagining that the cowboy had made a mistake. They thought they understood the situation because it fit the story they had always told themselves about people who lose loved ones or men who choose quiet, older women. But the truth was different, as it always is in life. The widow found a measure of peace and hope in the quiet of the ranch, and the cowboy found joy in her presence, in the sound of her laughter, and in the sight of her son growing stronger under his guidance. Evenings were the hardest at first. The silence of the house pressed in, and memories of the past crept quietly into the corners. The widow would sit by the cold fireplace, staring at the empty hearth, thinking of her late husband and wondering if she had made the right choice. But the cowboy never intruded. He would start a small fire, leave a warm meal, and give her space, showing through actions rather than words that he respected her history and her grief. Slowly, the warmth of his presence began to fill the empty spaces of the house. The townspeople continued to gossip, oblivious to the life being quietly built miles away. They imagined the worst. They imagined heartbreak and disappointment. They imagined that the widow's heart could not heal, and that the cowboy would tire of the quiet, reserved woman who had lost so much. But life on the ranch proved something different. It proved that love does not always announce itself with fanfare or spectacle. Sometimes love arrives quietly, in small gestures, in shared work, in patience and understanding. As days turned into weeks, the widow began to find comfort. She started helping with meals, caring for the animals with increasing confidence, and learning to ride alongside her son. The cowboy noticed her growing confidence and silently celebrated it. He knew that their love would not be measured by the opinions of others, but by the trust, care, and respect they built together each day. Even as they settled into their new life, the town continued to talk. "How long will she last?" they asked. "He'll leave her soon enough," they said. But none of them could see the quiet smiles shared over breakfast, the small laughter of a boy learning to ride, or the way the widow's eyes sparkled when she saw the sunset over the hills. None of them could see that the true story was being written in moments invisible to gossip, in moments of quiet devotion and care. By the end of the first season on the ranch, both the widow and the cowboy had begun to understand the value of their choice. The world outside could whisper, judge, and mock all it wanted. But within the boundaries of their home and land, they had discovered something rare: companionship, respect, and a growing sense of happiness neither had expected to find again. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they were no longer heavy. They were simply part of the story that had brought them together. And while the town would take months, perhaps years, to notice, the cowboy and the widow had already begun building a life filled with patience, understanding, and quiet love. The kind that whispers in actions rather than shouts in words. The wedding no one understood had begun to blossom, not in public spectacle, but in the small, steady rhythms of life on the ranch. Life on the ranch was very different from life in town, and the widow felt it immediately. The air smelled fresh and clean, but it also carried the scent of hay, soil, and cattle, smells she had never grown used to. The house was small, made of old wooden planks that creaked when she walked across the floor. The windows looked out over wide fields, hills that rolled gently toward the horizon, and cattle that moved slowly like living shadows across the land. For someone who had spent years surrounded by the chatter of neighbors, the hum of the market, and the laughter of friends, the quiet was almost too much to bear at first. She often found herself sitting by the windowsill, staring at the distant hills, feeling both awe and loneliness. Her son, a curious boy with bright eyes, was more at ease. He ran across the yard, examined the animals, and followed the cowboy around, eager to learn every small thing. The cowboy, patient as always, taught him gently how to lead a horse, how to feed the cows, and how to move confidently around the ranch. The widow watched them together, feeling a mixture of gratitude and unease. She was grateful that her son had someone steady to guide him, someone who could teach him things she didn't know. Yet she worried about her own place in this new life. She wasn't sure if she truly belonged here. The first few days were awkward. The widow struggled with simple tasks she had never done before. She tried to help with feeding the animals, but she dropped buckets of water or spilled grain. She attempted to mend fences, but the wood was heavy and the tools unfamiliar. The cowboy noticed her struggles but never spoke a word of criticism. Instead, he helped quietly, guiding her hand when needed and showing her the right way to do things. His patience was steady and kind, the kind of patience that does not rush or demand, but simply allows learning to happen naturally. At night, the widow found it hard to sleep. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of wood or the soft breathing of the animals outside. She would lie awake, thinking of her late husband, remembering the past, and wondering if she had made the right choice in marrying this cowboy. She worried that she had rushed into a new life too quickly, that she might disappoint him, or that she might fail in this unfamiliar world. Sometimes, her eyes would fill with tears, and she would quietly brush them away before her son awoke. She didn't want him to see her sadness. The cowboy never pushed her to speak about her feelings. He understood that grief and adjustment take time. Instead, he showed care in small, quiet ways that spoke louder than words. He would fix a broken step before she could trip. He would leave small gifts, like a handful of wildflowers on the kitchen table or a warm blanket draped over a chair. When her son struggled with a new task, he would kneel beside him, explaining patiently and demonstrating slowly. The widow began to notice these gestures, and gradually they made her feel safe and valued. Slowly, the widow began to find her rhythm on the ranch. She learned to feed the animals without spilling the water, to mend fences with skill, and even to ride a horse alongside her son. Her confidence grew day by day, small step by small step. The cowboy noticed but never praised loudly. Instead, he gave her a quiet nod, a gentle smile, or a soft word of encouragement. It was subtle, but it mattered more than anything the town's gossip could have said. Her son was the first to show the change. He laughed freely now, running through the fields with the cowboy, learning to rope cattle, and riding across the hills with confidence. He would tell his mother stories of what he had learned that day, his face bright and excited. The widow smiled at him, feeling a warmth she had not known in years. She realized that this ranch, with its quiet routines and steady rhythm, was helping her son heal just as much as it was helping her. The widow began to take pride in her work. She cooked meals for the household, learning new recipes that the cowboy had shown her. She tended the garden, planting vegetables and flowers that grew alongside the fences. She cleaned the house and made it feel lived in and warm. Every evening when the fire was lit in the hearth, she would sit quietly beside it, feeling the heat on her hands and watching the flames dance. The warmth of the fire seemed to reach deeper than her hands. It warmed her heart, reminding her that she had a place here, that she was building a new life, slowly but surely. The cowboy and the widow developed a quiet understanding between them. They didn't need grand speeches or dramatic gestures. He knew when she needed space and when she needed support. She knew when to ask for help and when to observe and learn. Their lives intertwined not through words but through shared tasks, shared responsibility, and the simple act of being present for each other. Outside the ranch, the town remained skeptical. People continued to gossip, imagining that the widow might regret her choice, imagining that the cowboy would grow tired of the quiet woman with a past. They didn't see the small, meaningful moments. The way the widow's eyes would brighten when she successfully guided the horses, the laughter that rang across the fields as the boy learned to rope cattle, or the quiet satisfaction on the cowboy's face when she learned a new task. These were the moments that mattered, the moments that built trust and connection. One afternoon, a storm approached. Dark clouds rolled over the hills and the wind picked up, sending dust and leaves swirling across the ranch. The widow watched as the cowboy secured the animals, checking the fences and making sure the horses were safe in the barn. She joined him, her movements confident and sure. They worked together side by side, and for the first time she realized how much she had grown. She was no longer the fragile widow who had arrived in town months ago. She was strong, capable, and part of this land. After the storm passed, they stood together, watching the sun break through the clouds. The fields were wet and glistening, the cattle moved slowly across the pastures, and the air smelled fresh and clean. The widow felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She turned to the cowboy, and he gave her a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement that they had faced the storm together, both literally and figuratively. Evenings on the ranch became moments of quiet joy. They would sit by the fire, the widow tending the flames while the cowboy fixed small things around the house or simply rested after the day's work. Sometimes they spoke of simple things, the patterns of the stars, the weather, or stories from their past. Other times there was silence, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with understanding and trust. The widow learned to enjoy these moments, realizing that happiness could be quiet and steady, not always loud or dramatic. The widow also began to notice small changes in herself. She smiled more often, not just out of politeness, but from genuine feeling. She laughed at her son's jokes and the cowboy's small stories. She felt warmth toward the man who had chosen her, who had never judged her for her past, and who treated her with patience and respect. She realized that she was learning to trust again, not only in others but in herself. She could make decisions, take risks, and embrace life in ways she had not thought possible. The boy, too, thrived in this environment. He learned to ride horses, care for the animals, and even help with small chores around the house. He began to speak more confidently, share his thoughts openly, and show kindness to the animals and people around him. The cowboy's guidance had given him stability and confidence, while the widow's care and encouragement had nurtured his emotional growth. Together, they were forming a new family, not defined by past losses, but by the love and patience they shared now. Despite the town's whispers, the widow and the cowboy paid little attention to gossip. They understood that life could not be measured by the opinions of others. Instead, they focused on the present, the animals, the land, the fire in the hearth, and the small joys of daily life. Each day brought new challenges and successes. Each night offered rest, reflection, and quiet satisfaction. In this steady rhythm, they found a form of happiness that was real, lasting, and deeply fulfilling. As the months passed, the widow's confidence and skills grew. She could manage the animals, cook meals, repair fences, and navigate the land with ease. Her son flourished alongside her, and the cowboy watched both with quiet pride. They had created a life together, simple but meaningful, full of small victories, laughter, and love that did not need to be loudly announced. And while the town continued to gossip, they could not see the true life being built on the ranch. They could not see the quiet smiles, the small acts of kindness, or the growing bond between the widow and the cowboy. They only saw what they wanted to see, a woman with a past and a man they assumed had settled. But in truth, the widow had found a new beginning, and the cowboy had found a companion who shared his life and his work, someone whose presence brought warmth to the long, quiet days. By the end of the first year on the ranch, the widow, her son, and the cowboy had created a life together. It was not perfect, but it was theirs. It was full of laughter, work, care, and love. It was steady and real. And although the town still whispered and judged, the people who mattered most, each other, were building a home filled with patience, understanding, and quiet joy. The widow often looked out at the fields during the evenings, watching the sun set behind the hills. She would glance at the cowboy, who was tending the animals or preparing a fire, and feel a deep sense of gratitude and peace. She realized that happiness could be quiet, that love could be steady, and that life could begin again even after great loss. She had discovered that true contentment was built not on the opinions of others, but on trust, respect, and small, meaningful moments shared with those who cared. And so, life on the ranch continued, each day building upon the last. The widow, the cowboy, and the boy learned to face challenges together, celebrate victories together, and find joy in the simplest things. They were forming a bond that no gossip could weaken, no doubt could break, and no past could diminish. Slowly and visibly, they were building something lasting, a family, a home, and a love that grew quietly, steadily, and beautifully. That year, winter arrived early and with an unexpected force. The hills and fields, usually dotted with cattle grazing quietly, were soon blanketed in thick snow. The wind howled across the plains, rattling the windows of the small wooden house and sending a chill that cut through even the warmest coats. Life on the ranch, already demanding, became more challenging than ever. The widow, the cowboy, and her young son faced the cold together, each day testing their endurance, courage, and patience. At first, the widow struggled. The snow was deep and heavy, making it difficult to move around the ranch. She found herself slipping on icy paths, pulling buckets of water from the frozen well, and shoveling snow to clear the barnyard. Each task felt like climbing a steep hill, and exhaustion would creep into her muscles by the afternoon. But the cowboy never allowed her to give up. He was always near, steady and calm, his hands strong and his guidance gentle. He would show her how to walk safely over ice, how to keep the animals warm and fed, and how to handle the cold without giving in to despair. Her son, full of youthful energy, found the snow exciting at first. He would run across the fields, making patterns in the snow with his small boots, laughing as flakes landed on his cheeks. But soon, he too felt the bite of winter, and the cowboy taught him patience and caution. He guided the boy carefully, showing him how to move in the snow, feed the animals efficiently, and stay warm. The widow watched them together, feeling a mixture of admiration and gratitude. She realized how much stability and wisdom the cowboy had brought into their lives, and she felt a deepening trust in him, a sense that they could face any challenge together. The stormy days brought more than just cold. Supplies became scarce, roads were blocked by snow, and neighbors who lived further in the valley began struggling. The widow noticed families in town struggling to keep warm, their windows frosted over, their children shivering. She could not ignore it. She turned to the cowboy, and though he rarely spoke with grand words, his eyes reflected understanding. They both knew what they had to do. Together, they would help no matter the risk. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, the cowboy loaded the wagon with firewood, blankets, and supplies. The widow insisted on accompanying him. She wrapped herself in thick layers, tied her son close to her side, and climbed into the wagon beside the cowboy. The animals pulled the wagon steadily through the snow, each step deliberate as they navigated the frozen paths. The wind blew fiercely, stinging their faces, but they pressed on. They were determined to help the families who might otherwise suffer through the night alone. As they traveled, the widow noticed how the townspeople reacted. At first, some stared with surprise, clearly shocked that the cowboy and the widow were venturing out into the storm. Whispers floated through the air, carried by the wind. Why are they risking themselves? She should stay inside, safe and warm. But the widow ignored the words. She focused on the task, on the people they were helping, and on the quiet satisfaction of doing the right thing. They stopped at the first house, where an elderly woman struggled to start her small fireplace. The widow and the cowboy worked together, arranging wood carefully, stacking logs so the fire would burn steadily, and showing the woman how to keep it going. The widow handed her blankets and helped the children onto a bench near the hearth, making sure everyone was warm and comfortable. The cowboy worked quietly beside her, steady and calm, his presence reassuring to all. The woman's eyes filled with tears, not from sadness but from gratitude. She had expected no one to come, and here they were, bringing warmth and kindness in the harshest of winters. They continued through the town, stopping at every house where help was needed. Families who had thought they would spend the night in cold fear were now safe and warm. The widow carried blankets, handed out food, and spoke gentle words of encouragement. She noticed the fear in the eyes of children who had never seen snow so deep, and she held them close, comforting them, showing them that they were not alone. The cowboy managed the animals, ensuring that the wagon moved smoothly, that the firewood remained dry, and that every delivery was safe. Together, they were a team, each complementing the other, working without complaint or expectation of reward. As the day passed, the widow began to feel a deep sense of purpose. The hardships of the ranch, the loneliness she had felt, and even the weight of her past seemed to fade in the face of this work. She was doing something meaningful, something that mattered. She saw the gratitude in the faces of the people they helped, heard the laughter of children who were warm for the first time in days, and felt the quiet pride of knowing that her actions, her courage, and her care made a real difference. By evening, the storm had grown worse. Snow fell heavily, and the wind howled like a living thing. The cowboy decided they should return to the ranch, but several families who lived closer to the edges of the valley could not make the journey. Without hesitation, he offered them shelter. The widow agreed, welcoming them into the warmth of the house. She began preparing hot drinks, soups, and blankets. Her son helped where he could, bringing firewood and handing out warm mittens. The ranch, once quiet and solitary, was now alive with people, laughter, and warmth. Inside the house, the fire roared in the hearth. The widow moved from room to room, making sure everyone had a place to sit, blankets to cover them, and something warm to eat. She smiled at the children as they played near the fire, watched her son teach a younger boy to tie a simple knot for the animals, and felt a glow of satisfaction she had never known. The cowboy, though busy checking the animals and repairing minor damage from the storm, kept glancing back at her, a quiet acknowledgement of the strength and grace she displayed. At one point, the widow paused by the fire. She watched the flames dance and thought of everything that had led her here. She remembered the loss of her first husband, the years of loneliness, the whispered judgments of the town, and the quiet courage it had taken to accept a new life with the cowboy. She realized that she had grown stronger, braver, and more capable than she had ever imagined. The fire warmed her hands, but it also warmed her heart. She felt peace, a deep and lasting peace, and for the first time in years, she smiled freely without reservation or fear. The townspeople, observing from a distance, were surprised. Some had mocked them before, thinking the cowboy had made a mistake in marrying a widow, thinking she would never be happy, thinking their efforts would fail. But now, as they saw her standing beside the fire, smiling and confident, their opinions began to shift. They could see that the woman they had pitied was not fragile. She was capable, strong, and kind. She was not defined by her past, but by the courage, love, and care she showed in the present. The storm continued through the night, but inside the ranch there was warmth, laughter, and safety. Families huddled near the fire, sharing stories and food. The widow moved among them, offering gentle words, making sure no one was left in the cold. Her son, tired but happy, played quietly with other children. And the cowboy, ever steady, watched them all, making sure the animals were safe. The fire burned steadily, and everyone had what they needed. In that moment, the town could finally see what they had failed to understand before. The widow was not weak, the cowboy was not foolish, and their life together was not a mistake. The fire in the hearth was more than warmth. It was a symbol of their resilience, their patience, and the quiet love that had grown between them. She stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her eyes bright, and her smile genuine. This was not a smile of pretense or politeness. It was a smile of peace, confidence, and trust. The widow realized, as she looked around the room, that they had created something extraordinary. It was not wealth or fame. It was not recognition or applause. It was warmth, safety, love, and community. People who had once whispered judgment now looked with awe and respect. The cowboy had chosen wisely, and she had chosen courageously. Together, they had built a life that could withstand storms, cold, and doubt. As the storm began to subside the next morning, the families departed, returning to their homes with supplies, blankets, and warm hearts. They spoke quietly to each other about the kindness they had received, about the strength of the widow, and about the steadfastness of the cowboy. Stories of their courage spread through the town like the first rays of sunlight after a long, cold night. The gossip that had once mocked them now shifted to admiration, though quietly and cautiously at first. The widow and the cowboy returned to their daily routines, but things had changed. They had faced the storm together, helped others, and discovered the depth of their own courage and partnership. The boy, now more confident and strong, followed his father in daily chores, laughing and learning. The widow, confident and skilled, moved through the ranch with purpose and grace. They had learned that life's true test is not in ease or comfort, but in facing challenges together with courage, patience, and care. And as they sat by the fire that evening, the widow placed her hand gently on the cowboy's arm. The flames reflected in her eyes, and her smile reached him fully. It was in that quiet, ordinary moment that they both understood the truth. Life could be harsh and unpredictable, but love, patience, and kindness could light even the darkest nights. They had endured, they had helped, and they had grown stronger together. The townspeople, too, began to see what they had missed all along. The widow, once pitied, was now admired. The cowboy, once quiet and reserved, was now respected not just for his work, but for his heart. The story they had mocked was no longer one of doubt or failure. It was a story of courage, compassion, and love that could endure storms and trials, that could grow stronger when tested, and that shone brightly in the simple act of helping others and being there for each other. Spring finally arrived on the ranch. The snow that had blanketed the fields for months melted slowly under the warmth of the sun, revealing the fresh green of new grass and the gentle buds of wildflowers beginning to bloom. The air was lighter, sweeter, filled with the sounds of birds returning from their winter travels and the soft hum of bees among the flowers. The ranch itself seemed to come alive with the season, the cattle grazing peacefully, the fences repaired and strong, and the small wooden house looking bright and welcoming under the morning sun. The widow stepped outside, inhaling the crisp spring air and feeling the warmth on her face. She watched her son run across the yard, his laughter echoing across the fields. She thought back to the days of harsh winter, the biting cold, and the challenges they had faced together. Everything they had endured had strengthened them, both individually and as a family. The boy had grown more confident, his skills on the ranch improving daily. The widow herself had transformed. The quiet, uncertain woman who had arrived months earlier was now strong, capable, and radiant with a kind of quiet happiness that could not be ignored. The townspeople began noticing the changes too. Slowly, quietly, their whispers shifted from criticism to curiosity, and then to respect. They began to see the widow walking confidently through the market with her son at her side, carrying herself with poise and assurance. They noticed the cowboy, steady as ever, working his land with quiet pride, always patient, always thoughtful, always kind. People who had once mocked the couple for marrying so unconventionally began to admire them, even if they did not fully understand the bond between the widow and the cowboy. One morning, a few neighbors stopped by the ranch. They had heard of the help the widow and cowboy had given during the harsh winter, of the families who had been saved from cold and hunger, and they wanted to see it for themselves. The widow welcomed them warmly, offering tea and bread she had baked that morning. The cowboy, standing nearby with his hands resting on the fence, greeted them with his usual calm, quiet smile. The neighbors exchanged glances, impressed not only by the hospitality, but by the way the widow and cowboy worked seamlessly together. They moved with a rhythm that spoke of trust, understanding, and years of shared effort, even if it had only been months. It was during moments like these that the widow realized just how far she had come. She had learned to care for the land, manage the animals, and maintain a household that was not only functional but warm and welcoming. She had learned patience, resilience, and confidence. And most importantly, she had learned that happiness did not have to be loud or dramatic. It could be quiet, steady, and deeply satisfying, born of care, kindness, and shared responsibility. Her son continued to grow, both in skill and in character. He learned not just how to ride horses and herd cattle, but how to care for others, how to show respect, and how to act with courage. The cowboy guided him with gentle discipline, teaching him the values of hard work, honesty, and integrity. The widow encouraged him, nurturing his emotional growth and helping him understand that strength could coexist with compassion. Together, they had built a home where love, respect, and learning were intertwined, and the boy thrived within it. As spring deepened, the ranch became a place where other families felt welcome. People who had once whispered doubts and criticisms now came seeking guidance or simply to share a moment of warmth. They brought their children, asking the widow to teach them simple skills like baking bread or tending a small garden. They asked the cowboy for advice on animal care or repair work. The couple gave generously, without pride or complaint, helping others because it was the right thing to do. The ranch had become a small center of community and care, a place where actions spoke louder than gossip ever could. One afternoon, as the sun lowered toward the horizon, the widow and cowboy sat on the porch together, their son playing nearby in the fields. The light of the setting sun cast a warm glow across the land, and the widow felt a deep sense of peace. She looked at the man beside her, the man who had chosen her despite the whispers, despite the doubts, and despite the pain she had carried in her heart. She realized that life had given her a second chance, and she had embraced it fully. The cowboy, sensing her thoughts, glanced at her with a quiet smile, and she knew he felt the same way. The townspeople began to understand that love, loyalty, and happiness do not always look the way one expects. They had mocked the marriage at first, believing it to be unusual or doomed. But as they observed the widow's confidence, the cowboy's steady presence, and the warmth of their family, they began to see the truth. Love was not always dramatic or flashy. It could be quiet, steady, and filled with small gestures of care and kindness. It could grow in difficult seasons, thrive through challenges, and become stronger over time. Years passed. The boy grew taller and stronger, learning from both his mother and the cowboy, becoming a young man of character and heart. He laughed easily, helped his neighbors, and carried himself with confidence. The widow and cowboy continued their routines on the ranch, sharing tasks, meals, and quiet moments by the fire. The home they had built together remained a place of warmth, learning, and love. The town, which had once whispered doubts, now told stories of the widow's courage and the cowboy's steady heart. They spoke of the winters they had endured, the families they had helped, and the love they had nurtured quietly on the ranch. The couple did not boast or seek recognition, but their actions had spoken for them, earning admiration that was well-deserved. As the years went on, the widow often found herself reflecting on her journey. She remembered the difficult days after her first loss, the loneliness, and the judgment of the town. She remembered the quiet moments of adjustment on the ranch, learning to feed the animals, mend fences, and manage a home. She remembered the winter storms and the ways in which she and the cowboy had faced challenges together. And she realized that every hardship had led her to this moment of peace, stability, and joy. The cowboy, too, reflected on their life. He remembered the days before the widow arrived, the quiet solitude of the ranch, and the sense of something missing in his life. He remembered the first time he proposed, the doubts and whispers, and the way they had grown together in patience, trust, and care. He realized that love was not about grand gestures, but about being there for each other in small, meaningful ways. The widow had brought warmth, strength, and joy into his life, and he felt a deep gratitude for the life they shared. One evening, many years later, the widow and the cowboy sat beside the same fire that had warmed them through so many seasons. The boy, now a young man, rode out across the fields, strong and confident, carrying the lessons and love he had received. The widow rested her head lightly against the cowboy's shoulder, feeling the warmth of the fire and the quiet strength of the man beside her. They had built a life together that had endured storms, winters, and doubts, a life that had grown richer with each passing year. The townspeople, reflecting on the life of the widow and the cowboy, learned an important lesson. They realized that judging others based on appearances, past experiences, or unconventional choices often leads to misunderstanding. They saw that true strength, love, and loyalty are built quietly, through actions, care, and shared responsibility. The couple had faced hardship, earned respect, and created a home filled with warmth and love, not through wealth, fame, or social approval, but through patience, courage, and devotion to each other and their family. The widow smiled again, this time fully and freely, and the cowboy returned the smile with the quiet pride that had always defined him. The fire crackled, the stars began to appear above the hills, and the ranch stood as a testament to resilience, love, and the beauty of a life built carefully, deliberately, and with heart. In the end, the story of the widow and the cowboy was no longer one of curiosity or gossip. It became a story of hope, courage, and second chances. It was a story that reminded everyone in the town that happiness could begin again, even after great loss, and that love could thrive in the most quiet, steady, and enduring ways. The widow, the cowboy, and the young man lived each day with gratitude and purpose. Their home remained a place of warmth, their family remained strong, and their love remained steady. The townspeople no longer mocked or whispered. They remembered the widow's courage, the cowboy's steadfast heart, and the quiet moments that had revealed the truth. Happiness is built in small acts of care, love, and patience, and true family is forged not by circumstance, but by devotion and trust. And so the story ended not with drama or spectacle, but with quiet contentment and enduring love. The widow and the cowboy, seated beside their fire, watched the sun set over the hills, their hearts full, their spirits at peace, and their lives a testament to the beauty of second chances and the power of love that is patient, steady, and true.